Good evening and welcome to the British Gerontology Society Special Interest Group on Aging, Business and Society at this, our third Longevity Week event. Inclusive innovation, addressing the underrepresentation of older people in clinical trials. Delighted that so many of you have been able to join us today. My name is Rob Walton. I'm the chair of the Special Interest Group, and our mission, and the mission that I've been tasked with as chair, is to enable people to age independently throughout their life course and do the things that give their lives meaning by facilitating collaboration between gerontology, business and civil society. I'd like to just say before we move any further to thank UKRI for their long-time sponsorship of the SIG and for whom this event would not be possible were it not for the UKRI's support of our organisation. In terms of housekeeping, the meeting is being recorded. We set aside ample time for everybody to participate, and we'd really like you to participate. This is a really important topic and one that's going to require input and participation. But until then, please, if you can, and it's at all possible, stay on the screen. We'd really like to see your faces in the gallery. But also, please stay muted if you're not presenting. If you do have questions that come to mind through the presentations, feel free to type them into the chat. And please use the chat now to introduce yourselves. We'd really like to build the community for the SIG and to understand where you're coming from, the organisations you're from. So please do just take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat. Also, if you do have any burning questions, feel free to raise your hand emoticon, which you should find in your toolbar, and we'll do our best to include you in the conversation. So without further ado, let's get into the topic of inclusive innovation, addressing the underrepresentation of older people in clinical trials. By way of background, they're in the UK, and I don't think anybody on this call wouldn't be aware of this data, but there are about 11 million people aged 65 and over, and they make up around 19% of the population. And actually, this figure is expected to rise quite significantly over the next decade to around 13 million. And despite the growing number of older people, their representation in clinical trials remains disproportionately low. Those over 65 are significantly underrepresented in clinical trials. And this exclusion leads to a lack of data on how new treatments affect this age group. And it's crucial that given their unique physiological and psychological characteristics, that higher prevalence of multiple health conditions, that we know more about them and include them in the delivery of clinical trials. By way of example, I just picked four broad disease states and some data points behind them. So Banzi in 2016 tells us that a study there that only 8% of clinical trial participants in dementia were 85 years or older, even though those aged 80 and older form the majority, 72% of patients living with dementia. In Parkinson's disease, which we'll hear a little bit more about from David Wilkinson later, older adults with Parkinson's disease are frequently underrepresented in clinical trials due to concerns about comorbidities and the complexity of managing multiple medications. Plasauka in 2024 revealed that 57% of Parkinson's disease trials had upper age limits of 85 years or less, significantly limiting the inclusion of older adults there. Osteoporosis, another example, treatments often exclude older adults, particularly those with multiple health issues, despite the high prevalence of disease in this age group. And broadly speaking, in cancer, Zhao in 2024 says that only 1.5% of trials conducted in all types of cancer specifically target people over 65. So during this meeting, it's our hope that we will explore the challenges and associations and opportunities associated with enhancing the participation of older adults in clinical trials. And through conversation and discussion, and through your questions and contributions, we'll uncover strategies to ensure that research truly reflects the diverse needs of our aging society. It's also my privilege to be able to show you a couple of slides at the end of this meeting about plans for the SIG moving forward in 2025 and some of the things that you may wish to participate and get involved in. So it's my absolute privilege to introduce some speakers who will be taking us through the session today. Dr. Declan Doogan, who is co-founder of Juvenescence, a company dedicated to extending healthy lifespan. Hannah Thompson, who is the founder and chief executive at Joy Club. Dr. Emma Harvey, who is vice president of the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Medicines. Jeremy Taylor, Director of Public Voice at the National Institute of Health and Care Research. Professor David Wilkinson, founder and director of the Parkinson Centre for Integrated Therapy. And Jeremy Higson, founder and chief executive at GCH Pharma Consulting. So I've now gone through the introductions, and here we are probably at about 5:10. I'm going to turn this over to the speakers now. They're going to speak for a short period of time. Altogether, that will come to about half an hour, 40 minutes. And then we'll have a big chunk of time around panel. We'll come together as a panel, give us an opportunity to answer any questions or discussion points. And then around 6:20, we'll look at the SIG plans and hopefully should be on time for a steady close at 6:30. So without further ado, I'd really like to invite Dr. Declan Doogan, co-founder of Juvenescence, to provide his input and participation.
Thank you, Rob. Good evening, everybody. Discussing clinical trials in the elderly. I don't have any slides, I'll just speak. When we develop a drug, we include what's considered a representative group of patients for whom the drug is intended. We also ensure that vulnerable subgroups are studied to establish, for example, pharmacokinetics and hepatic and renal function studies to understand how drugs are metabolized, which can lead to labeling restrictions. When it comes to the elderly, we know that drug metabolism is often reduced, which can lead to dosage modification. This is especially important where there is a narrow therapeutic index. I understand pharma being cautious about gathering data early on in the programs in elderly, which might incur inclusion of, say, off-putting safety labeling before a substantial body of efficacy can be added to make a more balanced risk-benefit assessment. It's also very different developing a disease-modifying drug whose effects may take years to fully manifest, as opposed to a more acute symptom reliever where much shorter periods are indicated and the willingness to accept some tolerability issues is higher. So what are we trying to solve for? The target population must be adequately studied with the understanding of the logistical and ethical issues. For example, frailty, institutionalization, multiple potential drug interactions, and ability to provide informed consent. However, let's say we're developing a drug for dementia. We obviously want to be assured of both efficacy and safety in the target population. If we included younger, otherwise healthy patients with early onset dementia who have more robust metabolism than an 80-year-old, for example, the efficacy may be relevant, but the safety quotient may not be. If the selection criteria results in a group of patients with no metabolic compromise, how representative of that would the population, the study be? Efficacy is key, and the use of real-world data can be very useful as a control group to put results into context. Both pharma researchers and regulators should agree what representative means for the intended population. We should have a consensus on predictive signals both for safety and efficacy in an elderly population, recognizing the heterogeneity of that group. Just calling somebody agent is not sufficient. They have to be characterized within the context of that therapeutic target group. A dementia patient might actually be different to a Parkinson's patient, an osteoporosis patient, given the attendant comorbidities. And again, I would suggest that we need to have a discussion and create a consensus view between the different regulatory, pharma, and academic groups in order to move this discussion forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Dick. Now moving on to our next speaker, Hannah. I think you want to load a couple of slides up.
Thank you. Yes, I will.
Oh, and while you're doing that, just to introduce Hannah again, Hannah is founder and chief executive at Joy Club.
Thank you very much. And it is my pleasure to be here this evening to share the views from our community, from the Joy Club community. So I'm not going to be sharing my personal views on this topic, very much the aggregate views of the community of the Joy Club on the topic of inclusion of older people in clinical trials. The Joy Club, if you haven't heard of it, is an online community for people in later life. We've got about 10,000 people. The youngest are in their 50s, the eldest in their 90s, average age about 69 at the moment. And when Rob and I first discussed this evening's session and topic a few weeks ago, I was really pleased to be invited along, but I didn't want to just come and share my views. What I wanted to do was to put a survey out on some of these key topics and issues and questions to the 10,000 community members and to capture their views and then bring those to you this evening. And so my slot is very much about that, talking through the survey results. And I've negotiated about 9 minutes for that. So hopefully those will be 9 minutes well spent. Of the 10,000, about 41 people participated. So that's lower than our usual survey participation. Not our usual topic, but maybe there's something to read into there. Of the people who did participate, 90 of them were in their 60s, 21 were in their 70s, and we had one participant who was in their 80s, and 38 of the participants were female. So it's very much a small sample size, very informal survey. You couldn't call this a formal piece of research, but I hope you'll agree with me as I share some of the findings that they're very interesting and worthwhile a slot this evening. I should also mention that if you try and find out more about the Joy Club by going to our website, you'll be bounced over to a different website over at Restless. As of today, the Joy Club has been acquired by Restless. And so this is my last formal engagement as founder CEO of the Joy Club. It's my last opportunity to represent the views of the community. And I'm so pleased that I get to do that on this very, very important topic. So when we asked people about whether they'd attempted to take part in a clinical trial, 44% of them had. For those that hadn't, the key themes around why they hadn't included the awareness. So people would say things like, I didn't know that I could participate. Nobody's ever asked me. Also, location and travel featured highly. And then concerns about safety, but it literally was only one person who had concerns about safety. Of those who tried to take part, only half of them had been accepted. And when we asked them the other half why they hadn't been, they said that they'd been totally ignored. So most people had never heard back after they had attempted to take part in a clinical trial. Location and travel featured highly again. And then one person, but only one person, had been told that they didn't match the criteria. The people who were accepted and did participate all found it very rewarding and interesting. People really were positively effusive about their experience. They really enjoyed taking part in a trial when they had done. When we asked people at the end of the survey whether they would attempt to take part in a clinical trial in future, interestingly, 78% of people would. So even the participation in the survey, the reading of the survey had doubled the appetite for participation in a trial, which I think is interesting in terms of how powerful tools like this are and how easy it is to increase awareness and appetite. And when people explained why they wanted to participate in a trial in future, they talked a lot about how they wanted to help Maybe they wanted to help themselves if they had a particular issue or illness that they wanted to overcome or have the chance of overcoming. They wanted to help their grandchildren, but they also wanted to help society as a whole. And for those who didn't want to participate, location came up huge, travel came up hugely as well. And then there were some concerns about safety of older people in trials and also the adequate representation and support of older people in clinical trials. But that was a handful compared to the majority of concerns around travel and location. Interestingly, when we asked people how they'd heard about trials, historically, a third of people had heard about trials from a health organisation. A third had heard about it in print media, like newspapers, but a quarter of this population had heard about trials on social media. So some people may have the view that social media digital strategy for this group it isn't the way forward, but I would say from this, we can see that it's a really exciting channel and certainly should be part of a channel mix around raising awareness. I also wanted to share some of the views, the lived experiences, and also the words of our community. So the next section I'm going to be sharing in the words of our community members rather than interpreting myself. And we put some of the paragraphs and the explanations from Rob that he shared with us at the beginning of this session around some of the issues in this space. We shared that text with our community so they could read and digest and reflect on that. And then we asked for their views on these perceived barriers for representation of older people in clinical trials. So having read about comorbidities and multiple medications and adverse effects and what our community thought about that perceived barrier, someone said that actually people with comorbidities and multiple medications must be included in the trials because to exclude them would introduce bias into the findings. Someone else said that I agree that comorbidities and multiple medications create an increased risk, but as long as those risks were pointed out and the participant gives consent, I don't see an issue. Someone else, and this was a view that was shared amongst many other people in the community, felt that this was a right. Actually, an individual's right is to have the opportunity to at least decide one way or the other. And a lot of people felt very strongly that that was the case. Then when we asked for people's views on the perceived barriers of perceived vulnerability, this was, again, it really had a very strong response from the community, and everybody who participated in the survey shared their view in free text form as well. So someone said, who perceives the vulnerability? Automatic classification of people over a certain age as vulnerable is discriminatory, in my opinion. Someone else felt that it was absolute rubbish, that even someone who is vulnerable due to physical, cognitive difficulties or both can be supported to make an informed decision if it is deemed to be appropriate to be invited in the first place. And someone else felt that it depended on the trial. Would the outcome of the trial be of benefit to the older person? Each case should be considered individually. We are perceived as vulnerable because of our advanced years, yet may have a stronger constitution than a younger person. And there were lots of other people that felt that way as well. When it comes to inability to consent, this was more of a polarizing issue in our community. There was more of a split of people who felt as a perceived barrier that this was something that we really should pay attention to. But there were lots of other people who had ideas for solutions to overcome this, even if they felt that, yes, this is a genuine barrier and should be regarded as such. So someone felt that this would open up the possibility of coercion. So it's important that anyone should be able to give their own consent. And few other people shared this view as well, that actually if you could no longer as an individual give consent in the traditional sense, so perhaps maybe you're more advanced in dementia, and you wouldn't be able to do that, they felt those people shouldn't be included in clinical trials. So there was that viewpoint, but actually there were viewpoints more on the other way. So people like this person saying that, yes, it may be problematic, but perhaps a son or daughter would have power of attorney for their health and be able to decide whether to consent or not on behalf of that person who was unable to give consent themselves. Someone else suggested that a person with dementia is not able to reason logically and should not be treated like a guinea pig unless they have given special consent with papers lodged at their solicitors prior to being diagnosed with dementia. And they felt it was sort of in the same way that some people leave their body to medical science, that you could essentially leave your body to medical science, but whilst you were still alive, even if your capacity for consent was no longer in place, which I think is a really interesting view. And finally, I'd just like to round off by sharing some views from the community, again, in their own words, and brilliant words, really brilliant words, as you're about to hear, on anything else they wanted to share. Beyond the very, specific questions that we asked and the evidence we put to them, we wanted their general view. And for somebody, they felt that this went well outside the clinical research setting. So this person had been, they were having mobility issues. They'd gone to a doctor. They wanted physiotherapy, but actually they'd been told that, you're in your 80s. So I'm afraid I'm not referring you to a physio. You're just going to have to, accept where you are now. And so they felt that this was a case of that. Many other people found that this survey helped to raise awareness of the issue of underrepresentation of older people in clinical trials. And now that they had been made aware, they felt very annoyed by it. And so a lot of people felt very strongly about this issue. And then finally, and I love this, someone felt that when it came to the representation of older people in clinical trials, it was really important that this happened. It should be the right of those individuals to be offered the opportunity. And when it came to the barriers, this person said, a lot of this comes down to lack of insight and rigor and poor vision, in my opinion. And I think that's a really interesting challenge for us this evening as panelists, to make sure that we're upping our insight, rigor and vision in order to come up with some really great solutions to this challenge and to increase the representation of older people in clinical trials.
Hey, Hannah, that was a really interesting, very strongly sentiment-driven piece of data. And I wonder, I'm sort of thinking about two pieces here, strengths and weaknesses. What would you say were the key strengths of the piece of work that you've done, and were there any weaknesses, biases that you feel like you should draw our attention to?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the strength of it is that it's wonderful to hear from people in their own words, from their lived experience, how they feel about this topic. Certainly lots of limitations in the piece of work. As I mentioned at the beginning, it was a very informal survey that was sent out to the community. And also it's a community of people who are online. And amongst that group, I'd say it's more highly skewed in terms of socioeconomic demographic. And it's also not a particularly diverse group of people. I'd say largely Caucasian. So I think that's a small sample size of people who are largely Caucasian, very digital and fairly affluent.
And very creative too, though. I mean, that idea, for example, around advanced consent. What an interesting concept, and I hope that the panel are able to discuss that later on in the session. But thank you for your contribution. Really excellent that you put this piece of work and the effort that you put into bringing this to this room today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you so much.
So I'm going to put the slides back up, and I'd like to introduce Emma Harvey. Emma is the Vice President at the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Medicine. I've known Emma for many years. I'm really delighted that she's able to join us today. And Emma, over to you. I'll move the slides forward at your request.
Thanks, Rob. So we've heard a little bit about why are the elderly not included in clinical trials. So I'm going to build a little bit on what Declan and Hannah have already said, and much of what I'm going to tell you is well-known information. There's a lot of research out there, a lot of researching why the elderly are not included in clinical research. So next slide, please. So interestingly, elderly patients use the largest proportion of prescription medication. So this is an audience that really should be included in clinical trials. And what are the reasons that they're not included? Next one, please. There are a number of challenges involved in enrolling the elderly in clinical trials. I think the most important thing to say, though, is that age per se is usually not a barrier to enrolment. So it's not your age, it's your health status. So clinical researchers, clinical trials want to have a clean and homogeneous population. And that's usually determined by the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And as we've already heard, elderly people are more likely to have multiple comorbidities. That means that they may become ill for a reason completely unrelated to the disease under study. And that can skew your study results. They may be taking lots and lots of different medications, and that can create issues with drug-drug interactions that then cause essentially artifactual illnesses. But one of the other challenges is the more drugs a patient is prescribed, the less likely they are to actually be taking them all. And one of the challenges of a clinical trial is you police it very closely. You make sure your patient is taking all of the drugs, and maybe they haven't actually taken half of them for the last 6 months. So that again increases your risk of drug-drug interactions or them having an adverse event to a different drug than the drug under study. And again, it skews your study results because you have to try and untangle cause and effect. And many diseases, as we know, disproportionately affect the older population. If you think about something like ischemic heart disease or strokes, they tend to impact middle-aged and older patients. And patients die from these diseases. So what happens if your patient dies during your study? Have they died as a result of the disease you're studying, or have they died as a result of another disease that they have happened to be suffering with? You have to try and untangle all of these things, and that can make things very complicated. So many of these issues are exclusion criteria for clinical trials, and companies want to try and keep your study population as simple and clean as possible. So very practical reasons for not including the elderly. Next one. What about practical issues? We've already heard about the challenge of, does your patient have the competence to sign consent? If not, do they have a proxy to sign consent on their behalf? This is not only for things like dementia, for example, but if you think about a disease where a patient could be ventilated, and therefore they're not conscious, they're sedated, being treated for something, and they can't actually sign consent form. Very often, older patients are not aware of clinical trials. They may not know what they are, so they're less likely to volunteer for them. And physicians very often don't ask older patients to volunteer for clinical trials because actually participating in a trial can be quite burdensome. Another practical reason, it actually takes longer to assess and consent an older patient than it does a younger and fit patient. And so that's a management issue, a logistics issue. Older patients may struggle with getting to study visits. If they have to visit a tertiary referral centre, they may have a lack of transport. There may be an issue with expense of getting transport to hospital. If they're going to be there all day, they need to be fed, they need to be hydrated. So practical issues that often put people off. And also retaining elderly subjects in trials can be quite a challenge, not just because some of them may die from other causes during the trial, but actually they get a bit fed up and they stop coming for study visits. So they're lost to follow-up, particularly for longer term studies. And you think about many of these diseases are longitudinal, perhaps a 5-year study period. That's a very big commitment for a patient to make. And also, if you're in a randomized controlled study, patients want to get the new study drug. They want the new sexy option. And actually, if they're not randomized to the active treatment and they're randomized to the same drug they've been on for the same last 5 or 10 years, they may be a bit disappointed and actually drop out because they thought they were going to get the new drug. Next one. So why is it important to enroll the elderly? We've already heard from Rob that the population is aging, and around 20% of the population is older or potentially geriatric. And trials need to have external validity, so they need to be relevant to the population that you're going to treat with the drug under study. In the USA, population over 65 takes 35% of all prescribed medication in the USA. So that figure alone justifies why we should be conducting clinical research in older patients. And as we've already said, some diseases are just more prevalent in the elderly, and you cannot easily extrapolate efficacy and particularly safety data from a younger study population. You have to be able to study the age group that you want to study. Next one. And what are the consequences if you don't study an aging population for a disease that disproportionately affects that population? Well, prescribers don't have the relevant information to appropriately prescribe a new medication. They don't know what the potential efficacy and particularly what the potential adverse events might be in that population. Efficacy could be lower, it could be higher. Side effects could be higher than in a real world population. And the other challenge, and we've seen this recently with some medications for an older population, is what about health technology appraisals? You need to get these drugs reimbursed before they can be used in the relevant population. If you don't have data in an older population, then bodies such as NICE and other reimbursement authorities are justified in saying you can't give us a benefit risk, you can't give us the right information to tell us that this drug is good value for money for this population. And so in many ways it's a missed opportunity. So I'll stop there, Rob, thank you, and move on to the next one. Look forward to the discussion.
As I was bringing the slides down, I can see there are a couple of questions here in the chat. One of them I don't quite understand myself, but I just wanted to ask it anyway. Maybe you have a better sense of it than I do. But the proportion of trials that are in person versus remote, is there any sort of view about effectiveness there? And then a question from Mark Venning, which is perhaps the word elderly itself is a negative descriptor. When does elderly begin anyway? Is it arbitrary based on a 20th century model, older age being a continuum? Any thoughts?
I think that's right. I think the world is changing, and actually we may have an aging population, but we have perhaps a healthier aging population, or at least that's the goal, to have a healthier aging population. The word geriatric essentially refers to patients over 75. That's a relatively arbitrary cutoff. But we know that as patients get older, they metabolize drugs differently. So they may have some element of renal impairment, they may have some element of liver impairment, potentially, cardiovascular impairment as well. And these features can all impact how the patient metabolizes the drug, and therefore how the drug affects them. I think in terms of remote versus in-person studies, it's a very good question. And the answer is it depends. It will depend on what you're studying. If you are studying a drug where you need, for example, to measure somebody's cholesterol, then you need to be able to do blood tests. So you can bring the patients perhaps to their GP surgery for the blood test. So I think that's a model a lot of people are looking at. Can you actually partner with the hospital and the local services? Or could you provide somebody with a finger prick test? So I'm sure many of us have been to our GPs recently for an over whatever age group health test, and they do a finger prick test that can tell you what your risk of diabetes is, what your cholesterol is, potentially some other tests. So you could potentially give a patient their own finger prick test for some results. You can give patients a blood pressure monitor. They can measure their own insulin if that's what's under study. So it really depends on what your outcome is, what your disease is that you're studying. Technology, wearables, these are all things that are developing at a very rapid pace. Companies are looking at ways to make this easier for patients to enroll. The regulatory authorities have recognized the need to study diseases in an aging population. I won't use the word elderly, but this is a work in progress, and I think this is a great question for the panel to discuss later.
Fantastic, Emma, and thanks so much for responding so vigorously to the questions from the audience. Just to encourage the audience, please do place your questions for the speakers in the chat. I know that I asked for people to put questions in for Hannah. We were a little bit late in the day reading that question, so I'll bring that into the panel later for the person who contributed that question. So I'm going to move along now, and similarly for other people asking questions, if we don't get to them in this session, we will get to them or try to in the panel. But I'm delighted now to introduce Jeremy Taylor, who is the Director for Public Voice at the National Institute of Health and Care Research. Jeremy, the floor is yours.
Lovely. Thanks, Rob, and hello, everybody. Can I just check everybody can hear me okay? Is that a yes? Good, right, yeah. Okay. I think that Declan, Hannah, and Emma, between you, you have kind of set out a really good set of issues around the difficulties and challenges in getting enough older people into clinical trials. What I want to do is give a perspective from the point of view of a funder, and in particular, what should a research funder do about the problem of underrepresentation of older people in trials. So NIHR is the largest funder of health and care research in the UK. As such, we do have some leverage when it comes to encouraging the right kinds of research done in the right kinds of ways. And I just want to go through, I've got 6 points that relate to the things that we can do to encourage a kind of research ecosystem that's less likely to underrepresent older people. First point is there is quite a lot of work to raise awareness of clinical research, and that directly speaks to some of the results from Hannah's survey. We're doing what we can to ensure that people are aware of the opportunities to take part in research. And so we have online platforms like Be Part of Research and Join Dementia Research. We also do a lot of collaboration with the NHS. There are different ways in which people find out about research. Often the best way is that a clinician says to you, you might be interested in taking part in this clinical trial. And we'd like those opportunities to be maximized. So the more people know, the better it is, although it doesn't specifically address the issue of underrepresentation of older people. The second thing that we are doing is putting greater emphasis on inclusivity in research design. We pre-announced that we were moving towards having research inclusion as a condition of funding back in July, and we are going to be essentially tightening the conditionality round about the end of this calendar year, so that people are under no doubt that in order to get an award from NIHR, they need to be addressing a number of factors around research inclusion. And what we said in the earlier announcement was, and I'm quoting here, good research must include people from the diverse populations of the UK and include more women, children, and older people. Research inclusion is an important key to improve health and care for everyone and reduce health and care inequalities. And so further guidance will be coming out around research inclusion and its relationship to a number of different underrepresented groups, including people of older age. That condition very strongly also aligns with NIHR's long-standing commitment to patient and public involvement, what we now call public partnerships. And we've recently launched our strategic commitments for public partnerships. It's a kind of refreshed strategy around everything to do with working with people and communities. And one whole strand of that, again, is about research inclusion, particularly, and I'm quoting here, make sustained progress in widening research participation, embedding research inclusion, and increasing the diversity of the public and communities who participate in, shape, and deliver research. And a lot of that is about building on the pre-existing UK standards for public involvement. So those two things together, I think, are strengthening our communication of our expectations as a funder around inclusion of underrepresented groups. A fourth thing that we do is provide advice and support to researchers on study design, including trial design. So we have a service called the NIHR Research Support Service that has a whole strand of work around advising research teams on all aspects of research design, including clinical trials. And a part of that is about communicating and disseminating our understanding of best practice in this area. I just wanted to flag up in that context something that hasn't yet been mentioned. The World Health Organization published guidance for best practice for clinical trials this September, so it's pretty recent. And that in turn is based very closely on work that was carried out by the Good Clinical Trials Collaborative, an initiative funded by UKRI and the Wellcome Trust, which started work in the middle of the COVID pandemic, actually, and a number of people from NHR and the wider health and research, care research ecosystem in the UK and overseas. It's a global initiative. We're involved in that. I just want to, so that guidance and knowledge of best practice is really important in this area. I just want to quote a few things very quickly from that best practice guidance, which also address some of the issues that previous speakers have raised. Inclusion criteria should not be unnecessarily restrictive. Effort should be made to include a broad and varied population unless there is a good medical or scientific justification for doing otherwise. Exclusion criteria should be focused on identifying individuals for whom participation would place them at undue risk. So I think that's a pretty good steer around the importance of inclusion and restricting exclusion criteria as much as possible, because as we know, the more exclusive a trial is, the more we have a problem of older people being excluded. Another little quote: relevant and easily understandable information should be shared with trial participants. It's really important that people understand what's going on, and that's very, very important and very relevant to their likelihood of being recruited and retained. The trial consent process should clearly explain to potential trial participants the reasons why the trial is being done, the questions it's seeking to answer, what is involved for them, the potential benefits and risks of participation, clear consent information, and the whole set of issues around consent, and I've quoted from a larger set of guidance, are really, really important. And then finally, I just want to flag up working in partnership with people and communities. Potential participants and members of the relevant community provide valuable contributions to the design, execution, and interpretation of RCTs. And I think that's really important. And certainly a big strand of NHR's work is communicating the importance of working at the trial design stage with the relevant cohorts of people. So if you want to recruit older people in a trial, why aren't you working with people from that community to help you with the design? Because the evidence suggests that if you do, you're more likely to deal with some of the barriers and obstacles and improve recruitment and retention in the trial. That I think it becomes particularly important if you're looking at cohorts from particular communities, older people, for example, from particular social demographics or particular ethnic groups, where there may be additional barriers to entry into a trial, where you need to understand some of the cultural and other factors and work with people from that relevant community to help you understand them and design for them. Final thing that I'll mention is you have to understand and be attentive to and be responsive to the experience of participants. We've got a little bit of a flavour of that from Hannah's survey. So the NHR conducts an annual survey called the Participant in Research Experience Survey, PRES. We survey tens of thousands of people and get a lot of very detailed information about what worked for them and what didn't. And that is really valuable information for helping to improve trial design. So I'll stop there. Just in conclusion, there's a lot that funders and research teams can do to improve the representation of older people based on what we already know about what works and about best practice. And I think it's a combination of raising awareness, of following good principles and practices when it comes to research inclusion and patient and public involvement. It's about following good principles and practice of trial design, looking at the most relevant guidance, some of which I've just been quoting, and it's about being really attentive to and responsive to the experience of participants, in this case, older people in trials. So I hope that gives you a good overview of some of the issues from a funder perspective, and I'll stop there.
Thanks, Jeremy. I can't help but tempted to ask a question based on one of the things that you said, but you made the quote that inclusion in clinical trials must not be too restrictive. So my question to you is, do you feel, based on what we've heard today, based on the conversation that we're having, that inclusion and restrictiveness is really part of the problem here in this particular patient community group?
Well, I think it is an issue, and I think Emma has set out very, very well some of the kind of understandable scientific and other reasons why it's not straightforward to say, well, you just shouldn't have any exclusion criteria at all. So I think probably it comes down to some kind of dialogue and negotiation where there's an opportunity to deal with conflicting objectives and come to a sensible conclusion. So I think the default option shouldn't be what is simplest for the trialist. Other considerations have to be brought to bear, and I think some of those principles of design, which do take a broader look, are important there. So I think it is about bringing the range of relevant factors to bear at the design stage. I think Emma might want to come back on that because I'm sure she'll have views on how that dialogue is best constructed.
Yeah, I'm going to ask that question to the panel too as well. So thank you very much, Jeremy. I really appreciate a very interesting presentation there. And if we can now invite David Wilkinson, Parkinson's, he's the Chief Executive and founder at the Parkinson's Centre for Integrated Therapy. David, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Not too much from me at this stage, given the time pressures. I'll just tell a brief story of a recent trial that we conducted here at the centre, which may inform the conversation, and then make a couple of comments based on what's been said so far. We've just finished a phase 2 trial, recruited 52 participants. It wasn't a drug trial, it was a brain stimulation trial. Very intensive, required our older participants, mean age late 60s, to come into the centre 12 times over a 1 month period. We were overwhelmed with interest, with people wanting to engage in the study. And I think we acknowledged at the outset of the study that the sample would be complex. We knew they'd have many comorbidities. We knew they'd be on multiple medications. We knew the levels of the disease severity would be quite variable. But because we knew ahead of time, we were able to model them in our statistical plan and to make a proviso for that as we move through the study. The group were clearly less familiar with IT than a younger population. Reluctance or problems filling in forms, seeing the online adverts for study. But again, we mitigated this. We wrote to people and we called to people on our membership list to inform them about the study. And then, as others have mentioned, some struggled a great deal with travel. If you have Parkinson's disease, even getting out of bed, having your breakfast, getting ready for the day is exhausting, let alone getting in a car or taking public transport to go to a trial. So they struggled and they found it tiring. A lot of them relied on state pensions, and so it was expensive. But again, we reimbursed people for all of their travel, and we were really flexible around scheduling them to make sure we fitted in with their health and social care needs. And so it was a bit of forewarned, being forearmed really. But we were rewarded in the fact that there were no dropouts throughout the trial, there were no protocol violations, and there was really high study satisfaction. Yeah, the sample was really highly motivated and really compliant. They had a vested interest in themselves, of course, but they wanted to do their bit for society. And they were really keen to participate in the next trial after finishing this one, which I think was echoed earlier with what we heard around the Joy Club survey. So I think really in light of our own experiences and the comments of others today, to me, the arguments for recruiting older people into trials are quite self-evident. I think for me, the bigger question is why research ethics committees and regulatory panels allow some trialists to overlook this logic, given the mitigations that can be put in place really quite easily. I think in terms of next steps, which I know Rob will turn to in the coming time, are there conditions that these gatekeepers should perhaps set, conditions for approval they should set, and are there things that we can be doing to really press that and lobby that, noting that the NIHR and the WHO are already being more inclusive, thinking about what next for us. Maybe we should be trying to find ways of reaching research ethics committees and the regulators to really press this need. I think maybe there's another issue here, which is probably more ideological than scientific. I think if we value the lives and the health of older people as much as younger people, then why wouldn't we give them the best chance to join trials and give them equal access? And again, I think it would be good to discuss how we might disseminate such an ideological rather than a scientific viewpoint to the broader community to encourage greater take-up. So those are just a few starters for 10 really from me, Rob, at this stage. I hope that's useful.
No, it's brilliant, David. I mean, it sounds to me as though you're kind of a leader in this space where actually you are presented with an issue where actually maybe exclusion would be a route to take, and actually you're doing something different. I mean, when we started to talk about this a few weeks ago, it felt to me that you were quite surprised about it being an issue at all. You know, so here you have something that's routinized in your own practice and your own operations. I really want to just ask you the question now. What did you think the immediate changes that could be made would be if you had a magic wand in a situation like that? What would you enable to be done differently now?
Well, it really, as I intimated, it comes down to the gatekeepers, gatekeepers for giving the appropriate approvals. And so, you know, Jeremy has helpfully said that the NIHR are really starting to push forward on this, but the NIHR is only the people at the start of the process in some ways. But you know, we need the people throughout the whole of the product development journey to be mindful of this. And so the regulatory bodies need to be saying we need to see evidence of this nature. We need the Research Ethics Committee, you know, to be on board. Unless they give consent, nothing can happen anyway. But there are key gatekeepers along that journey, which we may want to talk with and encourage to take this position. But in some ways, it is an ideological position as much as a scientific position, and that's where it becomes quite thorny, if I'm wholly honest with you.
Thorny indeed. Well, perfectly timed. We don't have a regulator in place or a gatekeeper in place, but we certainly have the nearest thing on this call. I'm very delighted to introduce Graham Higson, who is Managing Director, Chief Executive at GCH Pharma Consulting. Please delete as appropriate, Graham. I apologize for giving you two titles unnecessarily. But when we were planning this event, it became very apparent to us that we needed to hear from somebody who was close to the regulator, if not the regulator themselves or the regulatory authorities. And Graham has spent his career working with regulators, and so who better than to maybe give us the voice of God. So over to you, Graham.
I've never been called the voice of God before. Anyhow, thank you very much for the introduction. Yeah, as you've just said, I've worked in the pharma industry for 40 years, and my focus has been on getting drugs approved with regulatory agencies around the world. So I've seen lots of data, I've seen lots of drugs, and seen all kinds of challenges in clinical trials. When I started in the industry, typically clinical trials had patients between the ages of 18 and 65. And Emma laid out very well earlier on what the challenges are in avoiding confounding data in clinical trials. And that's basically what industry has tried to do over the years. And certainly younger patients weren't included in trials because maybe the companies hadn't developed the right dose forms for the younger children. Similarly for older patients as well. And also, I mean, what Emma put on her slide about older patients might die, might have all the various comorbidities, which just confuse the data. And then when you get to the end of the study, you have to try to explain what's gone on. And that's why some of those older patients are excluded. However, regulators recognize the challenges, and guidance notes have been issued. There's guidelines, there's all kinds of information out there, and regulators encourage companies to go and talk to them about how to ensure that you have the right age range of patients in clinical trials. If you think of the younger end, that issue got solved a number of years ago by a pediatric regulation being introduced in order to mandate that children are included in clinical trials. And incentives were given to the industry to ensure that that they had to do the studies. And today you can't submit a drug application unless you have done studies in children. Obviously, if it's not a childhood disease, you have an exemption. But if the disease is relevant for children, you must do a study in advance. For older patients, though, there's no such legislation in place. There's only guidelines, guidance notes, and encouragement to do that. Now, in Europe, the European Medicines Agency has a dedicated section on its website, which is called Medicines for Older Patients. They also published a geriatric medicines strategy, but that was back in, I think it was 2011 that was published. That strategy is based on two main pillars. One was on evidence-based medicine, which you'd expect, and also what they called the informed prescription. So ensure that you have your prescribing information, which covers older patients. Now, the agency declared back then that they would ensure that medicines for older people are of high quality and appropriately researched and are evaluated throughout their life cycle. And they said they would focus the use of existing regulatory tools in 4 areas. First one was on safety and efficacy, so ensure that the relevant information is in the prescribing text. The second one was to address knowledge gaps, and they highlighted frailty as an area that needed to have some more work done on it. The third area was on pharmacovigilance, which was focusing on the comorbidities and in specific side effects. And the fourth area was to foster expertise. And to do that, they established a geriatric expert group. The mandate, the objectives, the rules of procedure for the geriatric expert group were published back in 2013. And the pool of experts that they had assigned to that was refreshed in 2023. So that's what is said about that's where things are in Europe. The real question is whether there's any real progress, or this is just lip service. My view is it's a bit of both, in fact. On the one hand, I don't see much evidence of anything emerging from this geriatric expert group. And the EMA website, it actually looks more like a historical archive that it only has information on there, which are 10-year-old documents. And I don't think there's anything else that's been published since the initial strategy was put up there. However, as I said earlier, I've been involved with many drugs over the years and lots of clinical trials. And I do see that the reviews of new medicines now do include lots of assessment on different age cutoffs of patients. And companies are encouraged or required, depending how you want to look at it, to do their data cuts at 65, 75, and even at 85, just to compare what's going on. And prescribing texts increasingly have more guidance about what to do in dose adjustment for older patients. So that's where we are in Europe. In the US, there's more evidence of recent activity, and FDA held a workshop in 2021 on what they call was their roadmap to 2030 for new drug evaluation in older adults. And the workshop highlighted many of the points that we're discussing today. And I'm just going to read to you the final sentence from the meeting report, which was published in Clinical Pharmacology and Therapeutics. And it said, "It is essential that all stakeholders work together to further improve drug evaluation in older adults." I think the question that we probably would all agree on is, well, how are we going to do that? And that's probably the topic for the discussion. So thank you.
Graham, thank you so much. And actually, I think you give us the first question for the panel. if that's all right. So we're going to move over to open questions for everybody. I'm not going to particularly try to facilitate this, so please chip in and chime in. And if we're a bit reluctant, I'll start pointing at people as a kind of solution. But yeah, that quote's kind of interesting, isn't it? It is essential that all stakeholders work together for drug evaluation in older adults. And I guess the question I have is, how can gerontology, business and society work together to improve the inclusion of older people in clinical trials? It feels like, very similar types of questions. So and maybe, Graham, I'll start with you and we'll work our way through.
Yeah, well, I mentioned what was done for children. There was a piece of legislation introduced that mandated that children were included, and the pharma industry was given incentives to cover that. And lo and behold, we have trials in children. So maybe there's an opportunity there to think of some incentives to encourage older patients to be included in clinical trials, but it might need some mandatory legislation. You're on mute again.
Muted again.
I was going to say, Emma, what are your thoughts on this?
I agree. I think that is one potential part of the solution. I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all approach to this, but I think where you have a disease that disproportionately impacts older patients, I think then you have to have rules and regulations that require a certain cohort, a certain number of patients or proportion of patients, and you can stratify your analysis so you can analyze your older population separately from the main body of the population to see whether or not you get different outcomes, whether the safety is different, the efficacy is different. So it is possible to do it. It is more labor intensive, and because of that it is more costly. So I think Graham's point about incentivizing the pharmaceutical industry, which is really what we're talking about here, to do this research, I think is very important. So certainly for pediatrics, you get an increased period of exclusivity, which I think is very important. Your patent life can be extended. That's a big incentive for companies to do this. It does also require something of a sea change in attitude, I think, from people to, just to embrace this. It's a bit of a cultural shift, I think, for clinical research. And that's, that's an important thing for people to embrace. I do think, though, there is potentially a difference in approach between management or investigation of chronic disease as compared to acute diseases. So I work predominantly in infectious diseases, and then it's very difficult to say, well, we want you to have 20% of your study population over age 75, because actually you might extend your study period by 2 or 3 years, in order to try and get your elderly population. You may actually then do a disservice to your younger population because you're potentially impactful drug takes so much longer to get to market. So I do think there isn't a one size fits all approach. There needs to be some real good thinking about how you differentiate your approach to chronic diseases and diseases that preferentially impact the older patient as opposed to other diseases.
And presumably as well, that would apply, and I'm going to bring Dec in. You've been waiting patiently as our first speaker, but I'd love to bring Dec in now. But from a longevity perspective, where maybe the focus might be more on prevention at an earlier age to create longevity. I mean, I'm not an expert in this space, but I guess the question, Dec, is what are those first steps of collaboration, but understanding that need for a stratified approach? What are your thoughts?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's important, sort of intimated at the beginning, we need a multi-party collaboration and consensus, I would say, in order that those executing clinical trials have got a sort of guidance that they can relate to. As was said earlier, the RECs, if they don't have the, I suppose, the support of experts who have trodden this path before, they may make relatively uninformed decisions and guidance. When it comes to studying drugs for the elderly, I would argue that it's where the disease is established in the elderly groups, for example, dementia, Parkinson's and so on. It's a whole other can of worms, ball of wax, call it what you will, from drugs that help increase health span, where you would naturally begin treatment before you get old. So that's a different discussion altogether. And so we're actually looking at how to prevent people getting, well, actually it's disease modification really. You're either trying to stop the disease getting worse, in which case you're up for long-term studies. And as I said earlier, an acute treatment is a very different proposition from a disease modifier. So I think we need to have situational appropriate guidance and have these different bodies opine. For example, in dementia, there are expert groups who provide guidelines. And if you could provide those guidelines, then those should be broadly distributed so that the various constituents can actually adopt them. I think the regulatory bodies have got a big part to play. So does pharma, and I think pharma does change with with financial incentives. But I'm not even sure we need financial incentives here, because the pharma would love to provide the data for the appropriate groups, because that will enable their promotional capabilities as well, promotional stroke educational abilities as well.
Yeah, and I think that the cost issue is a really interesting one, isn't it? I mean, it feels as though that we're dealing with quite intricate, complex patients in a space where actually comorbidities and the aging process are taking place. Actually, people, you know, to your point, Hannah, when we have misconceptions around things like vulnerability, but the reality is that actually there's quite a lot of complexity, and the risk of people dropping out of clinical trials as they proceed through those journeys and their aging. I guess it comes down to a question of does that reflect in terms of the cost of the medicine? Is that something that maybe we've not, you know, raised the possibility or the prospect of? What are your thoughts on that? And Declan and Hannah, I think, will be great responders.
I'll leave it to Hannah first.
Sure, absolutely. And I'll come to this idea of cost, and I think that's an interesting thing in terms of a business perspective. But first, I just want to very briefly pick up on something that Emma said about cultural shift. And I think that's right. I think that cultural shift is at the heart of this issue, and it's many layers of cultural shift across many stakeholders. But at the heart of it, I think it's important to note that the nature of aging and being old, I think, is changing in lots of very radical ways. Obviously, we've got an aging population. That population is increasingly digitally literate. And what we see when we look at our community is that maybe that traditional idea of you're working in one job for a long time, you retire, almost completely, and then you have a very comfortable pipe, slippers, garden, comfortable existence in your cocoon and wanting to live out your years in a very safe and family-centered and maybe self-centered way. That perception of retirement and that experience of retirement, I think, is just being absolutely blown apart at the moment. What we're seeing is people aren't retiring suddenly from a job. They're having these portfolio careers. They're doing so many things. They're participating in the gig economy. They want to travel. They're using technology. They're divorcing their partner. They're dating. They are wanting to do some high-risk things as well. And they also really care. They really care about society, where we're at in terms of climate, where we're at as a society, and they want to be able to make some contributions. And so I think maybe our idea of this older person at the center of this discussion is maybe not the older person or the older people and the many, many different older people that are at the heart of this discussion. And so I think it's really important that we, whatever we do in terms of a solution, make space for individuals and their experiences, and that also we can, potentially look to business for ways of working that make the most of the opportunity that these big shifts present. I create digital products, so I work in a very different modality to most people on this call. But I have had to, for the first time at the Joy Club, working with people in later life as a customer group, I've had to entirely change my way of working and my entire way of creating product. And I recognize that, and I did that by including people in later life in design from the very beginning of the journey, and worked alongside those people to create and test the product, to create the brand, and so that people could really understand and benefit from that. So I think there will be ways of coming up with a solution, and by involving those individuals, I think we get to a solution, and we get to an interesting design. And then I think the cost piece is interesting, because it's sort of, the cost falls somewhere. And something that came out in the survey was that people felt that by not being involved in the clinical trial, they're still involved in a trial, because they will have those drugs when the drugs come to market, but it's just a trial without supervision. And so actually there perhaps is a greater cost in that sense by not allowing these people into the trial itself and giving them that experience with supervision, if they will end up having to take that drug later down the line.
Can I just jump in and comment on that? Because I think that's very true, Hannah, and I think that's where being creative in terms of research approach is very important. One of the drivers for pharma is, time to regulatory approval. That's a major milestone. The next milestone is time to reimbursement. So if it takes longer to study older patients, that's a sort of a disincentive to enroll them in trials. But I think that's where post-marketing studies could be very beneficial. If you want to do an accelerated study that's easier to do, let's say in the 50 to 65 population, you get a good body of data. You can perhaps do a small pharmacokinetic study in older patients to look at metabolism, and then looking at things like real world evidence. So yes, you prescribe the drug for your 65 to 100 population, or whatever age group it is, but you enroll them in data collection where you are looking at the efficacy and the safety in a more naturalistic setting, and that is then used to enhance the label later down the line. I think that's something that hasn't been used consistently for the older population. It is used in many settings, but that's perhaps a tool that could be used more creatively. And I think that's then where things like industry, academic and clinical partnerships would work very well. And, working with groups like NIHR, if it's the pharma company that funds the original registration trial, then partnering with bodies like NIHR to do the real world data collection in the different populations that haven't been formally studied in a clinical trial, I think could be a very creative approach to addressing some of these challenges.
I would fully agree with that. And I think to say that elderly really is just a number. The heterogeneity of elderly is incredible. I mean, I live in a almost retirement community. Most of the people are successful retirees, and they are a very vigorous, cognitively engaged population. They're not moving around with Zimmers, with somebody mopping their drool, not at all. And so I think, to what was said earlier, the concept of an elderly person has to be very broadly interpreted now. And that's where real world evidence can be hugely important. And the FDA is actually becoming really quite helpful in providing guidance there.
Jeremy?
Yeah, I think real world evidence is really important, but we should be careful not to let trialists off the hook and allow them to do unrepresentative trials and then try and repair the damage later. So I think there's a little bit of a problem about getting the right balance between those two. The point about heterogeneity, I think, is really important, because Hannah, you were describing a group which you had previously described as being, quite affluent, white, sort of professional, and all the factors, aging, and how it's different these days. Completely, I relate to what you were saying, but you also have to think about the people who are in their mid-50s and are prematurely old. Men living on their own who are obese, who've got mental health problems, who smoke, and have an internal heart age of maybe 80 or something, who may not be reluctant to engage with research, may not know about it. And so we do need very differentiated approaches, I think, to getting people to be aware of and interested in and able to participate in research. I think, sorry, I know that we probably want to get on to other questions, but I think the whole issue of what's the right balance between carrots and sticks, if you like, I think is really important. I think there is something about understanding what it is that makes trialists not follow the guidance and guidelines. Do we have conflicting incentives? Are some of the incentives around keeping the trial cheap and simple? And therefore, if we also come along and ask people to do complicated things, it's difficult for them. I think we need to, you have more effect when your combination of carrots and sticks work in concert and don't pull in opposite directions. And I think often in the problem with policy is that we have conflicting objectives and conflicting tools, and then we can confuse people. I do, though, like the idea of getting research ethics committees a bit more wised up about these issues and perhaps taking a harder line. I think it was David's point originally. I think that's a very strong one, and perhaps one that would be a good next step to think about.
David, do you want to give us your thoughts on that, and come to Graham? And then what I'd like to do is just to move a little bit to some of the comments in the chat.
I'll just make a couple of other points. I think the ideas around legislation and recommendations for best practice, they're really well received. I'm mindful that by the time older people present with some medical conditions, it's actually too late to do much about it. So within my field, neurodegeneration, by the time you present with Alzheimer's or another progressive condition like Parkinson's, there's only so much you can do. So we don't want to exclude these kinds of folk from preventative studies, even if by virtue of being older, they may be closer to disease onset. So that was one thought. Another thought is, I think, if we are to rally a call to action, which I think we're kind of moving towards, I really like the suggestion around a multi-stakeholder consensus paper. I think that would be a really powerful place to start. I think the other point, it just occurred to me while while others have been talking, is that the biological reality is that we age from the moment we are born. And yet, from a societal perspective, we seem insistent on imposing these cut-offs and these categories. And they're completely arbitrary. But it is such a deeply ingrained cultural bias. There's another workshop to have, I think, really around how we try to encourage society to reconceptualize the lifestyle journey, recognizing that people at all ages have very significant health challenges, and that the challenges we see in older people really should be seen in a broader context and not as something separate and a group over there that we'll deal with as and when we need to, which sometimes it feels a bit like. So yeah, maybe asking more questions than giving answers, Rob, but those are some reflections on what others have said so far.
Well, we will get on to immediate next steps, recommendation, call to action. But Graham, can I ask you for your comments?
I don't really have anything to add there, Rob. So I think moving on to the call for action is probably a good thing to do now. Okay,
before I do that, just quickly, what I would like to do is just to move to some of the comments in the chat. There's been quite a lot of interaction, particularly on this business of heterogeneity and inclusivity. We had a comment here from Alexandra Melling, which I think is very interesting, from talking about gender split in a study that she has conducted of 300 people. She's seen a 60-40 split female to male. I think there's also a question here from, just looking for it now, Diana Guamena, in relation to intersectionality. So thinking about, there are certain populations, not just in the older community, but in all communities, but let's stay here with the elderly in the older communities. But this idea of trust and trust as a blocker, trust as a driver of low participation in clinical trials. Does anybody want to weigh in on that? Maybe I can start with you, Hannah.
Yeah, certainly. And I think this will come down to, in part, maybe this question around diversity as well. So what I found from the Joy Club community in terms of trust, very, very high levels of trust. There were, a handful of comments around concerns around safety, concerns around representation of older people in clinical trials, but really it was a handful. And overwhelmingly, there was this sense of not just trust in the process, but also an entitlement of, I should be part of this. And it's really wrong that perhaps I'm not being considered. Something else that I do is volunteer with Age UK, and I come into contact and support a very different type of community through that work. And I'm a befriender, including for a lady who originally was from Sierra Leone, and she's spent the last 40 years here and has had her children and her grandchildren here. And when COVID appeared and we were all being encouraged to get vaccinations, she was incredibly nervous around that. She didn't want to be vaccinated. She didn't have any trust in the system, the clinical system, research, trials, vaccination. That was so low, and that was true as well for her immediate family and other community members. So I think the question of trust may be very deeply embedded in particular communities and groups. And from what I can see from the Joy Club community, very high trust, and it's not an issue there. But I think as a limitation of that survey, as we know, and we've discussed, it's not representative of the population as a whole.
Thanks so much, Hannah. Emma.
Yeah, I just want to add, I think, to Hannah's points and Diana's question. I think the challenge of ethnic diversity in clinical trials is another hot topic, because it can be very difficult to get non-Caucasian patients into clinical trials. And there are particular areas, for example, bone marrow transplantation, organ transplantation, where actually donors are significantly underrepresented, and that makes a huge issue then for managing certain diseases. If you don't have good matches for bone marrow transplants and so on. So Diana, yes, it is a major issue. It is often very much down to trust, and there is a lot of work going on to try and build trust with different ethnic groups to ensure that racial and ethnic diversity is appropriately addressed, not only across clinical trials, but across healthcare generally.
And Jeremy, can you be the final comment on this? We've got a couple of minutes left after this.
I put a brief comment, reply to Diana in the chat, but yeah, this is very much on the NIHR's radar, that there is a body of evidence about how to go about earning trust. So we're not starting with a blank sheet of paper. It is about outreach. It's about building relationships. It's about working through intermediary community organizations and faith groups and other trusted community organizations. Most of all, I think it's about creating a kind of stance as between the researchers and the communities, which then doesn't feel to the communities like a bunch of aliens in white coats coming to exploit them. It's got to feel reciprocal, and it's got to feel that the benefits to those communities have to be clearly felt and understood. And all that takes time. So I think the being in a rush, as we often are, is the enemy of building relationships and trust. And we have to get better at doing that and taking the time to do it.
Really well said. And talking of being in a rush, let's just think about, spend a couple of minutes, if it's all right. Really, I want one thought from each of you about what can make tomorrow different. And please keep it nice and tight, because we still have to do a couple of other things at the end of this session. Let's start with you, Jeremy.
I think making both the scientific case for why you cannot exclude older people and expect to have good quality research, and the moral case, which is, older people have a right to be involved too. There's some combination of those, which I think is a very powerful motivator. We probably need to get better at making those twin cases.
David.
I concur entirely with Jeremy.
I think Graham has dialed off, and I think Declan has dialed off, but Hannah?
Yep, I would third that, and also add the point around recognizing the heterogeneity and the individuals, and treating them as adults as well, older adults, but they are adults, and we shouldn't infantilize them in the process or conversations.
Jeremy, did I ask you? I did, didn't I? Yeah,
Yep.
Sorry. Emma.
I agree completely, but I think it's also about awareness. So it's building awareness of clinical trials, not only with the aging older population, won't use the word elderly, and also within the research groups, within pharma companies. Why is it important to include elderly populations, and ensuring then that trial budgets are appropriately addressed to make sure that the right patients get studied, not just the cheapest patients to get studied.
Brilliant. And there were a few comments in the chat here that I don't want to forget and would like to make sure they're recognized on the tape, but also to how we use digital, how we expanded trial research in primary care, an important partner there, how we work with private providers to ensure there's equity in clinical trials. And of course, let's not forget the all-important idea of the collaboration statement. So I think one of the things we'd really love to see coming out of this is maybe one of these organizations, if there was any here, that would be able to facilitate the development of that. Certainly that's something that we'll pick up as an SIG, and hope that we can collaborate with others to create the development of that consensus statement. So watch this space. What I'm going to do very briefly is just walk through. I think we're at the end of our session now, but I'd like to just draw people's attention to some of the things that are coming up for the SIG in 2025, and actually sooner than that. We have developed a survey for our 550 plus members, of which we've got a nice number of them attending today. This will be going out to the membership probably in the next 10 days. We're certainly ready to do that. So we really want a good response to that. So when it pops into your inbox, please, it's quite a simple survey, but please just take the time to let us get to know you a little bit better, so that we can better respond with the offerings that we make. And thanks for everybody in the SIG leadership team who's helped us to develop that survey. In January, we'll be holding a leadership team meeting to ratify our plans for 2025. We'll also be conducting another workshop, which will be led by Aging 2.0, Eric Kilstrom, on aging in place. In February, we'll be conducting an event in Kent at the Innovation Park, where we'll be conducting a best practice sharing event, where we're very lucky and delighted to be able to host delegates from Japan with a great deal of experience, obviously, in responding to an aging population. We will be publishing the events of the survey in March. We're looking forward to working with UKRI in April for the development of a workshop on inclusive aging. And hopefully we'll be able to pull all of this together through a series of short and accessible reports, which we'll be presenting in a policy-directed event at the BSG conference in June. So quite an exciting year ahead for the SIG. If you want to follow us on LinkedIn, here is the QR code. Just take a photograph of it now and it will take you straight to the page. Of course, you can watch us on YouTube on the Aging Bites channel. This video will be uploaded in the next week or so. So if anybody wants to see it again, obviously compelling viewing. So take an opportunity. But all of our library of events can be found on there. And finally, if you've got anything you'd like to say to us directly, you can contact us at the abs-sig@britishgerontology.org. Just safe to say thank you, everyone, for coming today. We're bang on 6:30. It's been an absolute pleasure to participate with all of these brilliant speakers and this very wonderful and curious audience, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Don't forget the survey. All right, thank you.